Dear Dr. Pavlov, I'm writing to you at an hour when no sane man would still be awake. But after all these years, sleep and I remain distant strangers. What I'm about to tell you may sound like madness, but please bear with me. My wife, Anna, is gravely unwell, and I fear it's my doing, however unintentional. I have no one else to turn to, and you may be the only person capable of understanding, even if you cannot fully believe. The story begins with something I have never shared, something I brought with me to America in the early 1950s, and buried deep in my past. I left Russia because of it, desperate to escape the ministry's reach, and their attempts to make me question my own sanity. They told me what I'd seen was impossible, that it was a product of my own disturbed mind. But I know what I saw, and I brought proof of it with me. In the winter of 1949, I was stationed as a military guard in a secret laboratory outside of Leningrad. I was young then, loyal to the motherland, and they told me I was protecting a great scientific advancement. The project was called the Sleep Project, and it involved 5 political prisoners who were told that they would be set free if they could stay awake for 15 days. To ensure this, they were exposed to an experimental gas, a stimulant designed to eliminate the need for sleep and keep soldiers alert. My orders were to observe, report anything unusual, and keep the prisoners confined. When we first arrived at the laboratory complex, the winter cold was intense, with the building nearly buried in snow. From the outside, it looked like just another concrete structure, with little to indicate anything unusual. Inside, the setup was stark and clinical, designed purely for function. The prisoners were kept in a plain, windowless room with a single overhead bulb casting a dim light. 5 cots lined one wall, not for sleep, but as places to lie down and rest without closing their eyes. A metal grate in the floor center allowed for drainage, and a small toilet stall in the corner offered minimal privacy. Each prisoner wore thin, worn clothes, no blankets or pillows, deliberately deprived of comfort as part of the experiment. Food was delivered at strict times, though it was nothing more than a bland paste meant to sustain them. They ate quickly, resigned to the tasteless routine. The guards and scientists ate better meals elsewhere in the building, and though the prisoners couldn't smell it, we sometimes returned from breaks feeling guilty, a strange sense of unease setting in as we faced their meager portions. I wasn't the only guard on duty. 3 others shared the same rotation, though we rarely spoke unless required. Our orders were clear: observe, report, and keep the prisoners contained. Still, over time, I grew close to one of them, a young guard named Yuri Ivanov. He had a nervous laugh and smoked constantly to calm his nerves. During the late shifts, we'd sometimes exchange a few words or share a cigarette in silence, each of us glad for the company, even if briefly. Yuri was the only one I felt any real connection with. And when I left for America, I thought I'd hear from him someday. But I never did. Part of me fears he's been silenced, along with the others. Just another effort by the ministry to erase everything that happened there. For the first few days, the prisoners grew agitated, but nothing more. They argued over minor things: who could use the toilet first, who got the last spoonful of food, who was taking up more space than necessary. The scientists assured me this irritability was expected, a sign the gas was working as intended. Each day I logged any changes, watching from the small window in the door. By the third night, the temperature dropped further. The vents rattled, barely keeping the room above freezing, and the air was thick with the stale smells of metal, sweat, and disinfectant. I'd hear them pacing, shifting restlessly on their cots, unable to get comfortable. They seemed on edge, avoiding one another's gaze, huddling near the walls, yet constantly alert, as though bracing for something unseen. On the fourth day, I sensed a change. The prisoners looked at each other with suspicion, even fear. It was as though the gas had started to do something beyond simply keeping them awake. I started to wonder if my role was just to keep them inside, or if it was to prevent something far worse from getting out. On the sixth day, a scream shattered the silence. It was the youngest prisoner, a thin, gaunt man with a face like a skull, who shrieked as if he were being torn apart from the inside. He screamed for hours, clawing at the walls until his fingers bled, but the others didn't react. They sat, staring into space, hollow and unseeing, as if his agony were merely background noise. Things only grew darker. By the 10th day, the prisoners began to mutilate themselves, tearing strips of flesh from their own bodies. The wiry man scratched at his arms, pulling away skin and muscle as if they were debris. Blood smeared the walls, pooled at their feet, and yet they seemed detached, mechanical, as though their bodies were nothing but objects to dissect. I saw one prisoner tearing open his own abdomen, examining his organs with an eerie calm. The scientists finally decided to end the experiment, cutting off the gas. But the prisoners turned violent, clawing at the door, pressing their faces to the glass, screaming for it to be turned back on. One of them whispered, "Let us stay awake. They're waiting when we sleep." They were terrified, as though the gas was all that protected them from something far worse. On that day, I made the mistake of entering the chamber, compelled by something I could not name. Only 2 prisoners remained, both skeletal, mutilated, barely human. The wiry man, his eyes hollow, grabbed my wrist and looked at me with a cold, vacant smile. "You'll never escape," he whispered, his grip iron-tight. "We are what waits behind closed eyes." I fled Russia shortly after, haunted by that smile, that voice. But I couldn't leave it all behind. Against all reason, I brought a single vial of the gas with me to America, hidden in the lining of my luggage. I told myself that I needed proof, that maybe one day someone would believe me. But I was afraid of what might happen if someone used it again. I locked it away in a safe, buried it in the back of a closet, and tried to convince myself that it was gone. For decades, I kept it hidden from Anna. She knew I'd worked on a classified project and that it had left me with memories I wouldn't discuss, but I told her nothing more. Lately, though, she's been struggling with her own nightmares, waking up gasping, drenched in sweat, speaking of shadows and eyes in the dark. I tried to comfort her, assuring her it was just a dream, but the nightmares continued. A little over a week ago, I came home to find the safe door ajar. Somehow she'd managed to get it open. Perhaps she'd once seen me enter the code and remembered. Inside, the vial had been disturbed. Its label faded but still readable. Sleep Project. My stomach dropped as I realized what must have happened. She likely thought it was something to help her sleep. A sedative of some kind. I imagine she opened it and inhaled the entire contents, unknowingly exposing herself fully to its effects. When I confronted her that night, her eyes filled with tears. She admitted that she had taken the gas, that she thought it might help her finally get a peaceful night's sleep. She begged my forgiveness, realizing only then that whatever she had inhaled was no ordinary sedative. She promised me it was only a small dose, that she hadn't meant it to go behind my back. But I could see it had already taken hold. For the first few days, I tried to believe she would be all right. She seemed no worse than before, perhaps a little distant, slightly less responsive, but still my Anna. But by the fourth day, she began muttering to herself, low, garbled words I couldn't make out. Her hands shook, and she would scratch at her arms, leaving thin red lines along her skin. On the fifth night, she didn't come to bed. I found her in the kitchen, staring at the wall, her eyes wide, bloodshot, as if she hadn't blinked in hours. I touched her arm, but she didn't turn. She simply whispered, "They're still here, Dmitri. They're still waiting." Her voice was distant. By the sixth day, she'd begun to withdraw entirely, refusing food, refusing to leave the house. Her skin had grown pale, her cheekbones sharp and hollow. I caught her one evening staring into the bathroom mirror, her mouth moving soundlessly, her gaze empty, as if she were looking into a place I couldn't see. When I asked her what she saw, she only whispered, "They're behind my eyes. They're watching." Last night, the seventh day, I found her in our bedroom, sitting on the floor, surrounded by scratch marks she'd dug into the wood. She looked up at me, her face stretched into that same smile I had seen all those years ago in the chamber. Her eyes wide, empty. "I understand now, Dmitri," she said, her voice barely more than a rasp. "We can't escape them. They're waiting behind our eyes." Dr. Pavlov, I don't know if there's any way to reverse this. I kept the vial all these years, thinking I could bring it to someone who might believe me, yet too afraid that it would be misused. And now it's destroying the only person I have left. I am begging you, tell me if there's something I can do to bring her back. I cannot bear to lose her to this madness. Waiting desperately for your response. Dmitri.